Elise Tan had always been determined, bright, and full of ambition. Born to a middle-class family in Singapore, she was taught by her parents to be fiercely independent and pursue her dreams no matter the obstacles. As a child, she would spend hours reading legal books borrowed from the public library, dreaming of becoming a lawyer who would one day bring justice to the oppressed. Her parents were proud of her dedication and did everything they could to support her education. At the National University of Singapore, the top university in the country, Elise thrived. She consistently topped her class, earning accolades from her professors and securing prestigious internships that promised a bright future in law. It was there she met Paul Lim, a charismatic young man from a wealthy, traditional family. Paul, unlike Elise, did not excel academically, but his confidence and charm captivated her. They fell in love quickly, and Elise believed that together they could overcome any challenge. When Paul proposed after graduation, Elise accepted without hesitation. She was in love, and the idea of starting a life together seemed like the natural next step. But Paul's family had different expectations. They insisted that Elise give up her career aspirations to become a stay-at-home wife, a role deemed suitable for the daughter-in-law of the Lim family. Elise, torn between her dreams and her love for Paul, reluctantly agreed, believing she could find happiness in this new role. In the beginning, their marriage was filled with blissful moments. Elise adored Paul and found joy in the little things, like preparing his favorite meals and waiting eagerly for him to return from work. But as time passed, the emptiness began to gnaw at her. She felt her talents were being wasted and grew increasingly restless with the monotony of her new life. Still, she chose to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the love she had for her husband. One night, as Elise sat alone in their luxurious apartment, she noticed Paul's iPad on the table, buzzing with notifications. Curious, she picked it up, and her world came crashing down. A series of messages from a woman named Jane revealed an affair that had been going on for 3 months. Elise's heart shattered as she read the exchanges, intimate, affectionate, and filled with promises of a future together. At first, she felt only a deep, unbearable sadness. She locked herself in the bathroom, sobbing uncontrollably, feeling every part of her being break into pieces. Then, something shifted within her. Her sorrow began to morph into anger. First, she despised herself for what she had become, a woman who had given up everything for a man who had so callously betrayed her. She had traded her independence, her dreams, for a life that now felt like a gilded cage. Then, her anger turned toward Paul. When Paul returned home late that night, Elise confronted him. The argument escalated quickly. Paul, at first, denied everything, accusing Elise of being paranoid and deceitful. But as she pressed, he finally admitted to the affair, his tone turning cold and dismissive. He blamed Elise, claiming she had changed, become dull and uninteresting. He went further, suggesting that she accept the affair, turn a blind eye, and continue their life as if nothing had happened, arguing that she had no other options. Paul's words were like a dagger to Elise's heart. Her anger became rage, a furious storm that clouded her mind. She stormed out of the apartment at 1 a.m., jumped into her car, and drove with no destination in mind. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her foot pressed hard on the accelerator as she sped through the empty streets, her vision blurred by tears. The car skidded dangerously on the curvy mountain roads, and with a final, violent twist of the wheel, she lost control, crashing through the barrier and plunging off the mountainside. As the car hurtled downward, time seemed to slow. Memories of her childhood, her parents' love, and her dreams flashed before her eyes. She felt a deep sorrow for the life she would never have, and a burning anger at Paul for what he had done to her. With her last breath, she cursed herself for her choices, but most of all, she cursed Paul. That curse, fueled by a heart filled with hatred, was strong enough to pierce the veil between life and death. When Elise's broken body finally came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, her spirit did not ascend. Her anger was too powerful, her desire for revenge too strong. She transformed into a vengeful ghost, bound by her hatred and given a chance by darker forces to seek retribution. A week later, Paul organized a grand, traditional Chinese funeral for Elise. Guests filled the hall, murmuring about the tragic accident that had claimed her life. Elise's parents were inconsolable, their grief raw and all-consuming. They demanded answers from Paul. Why was she driving so late at night? Why was she speeding? But Paul avoided their questions, staring at the floor with a carefully practiced expression of sorrow. The guests assumed Paul's demeanor was due to deep grief, but in reality, he felt little more than annoyance at the inconvenience. All he could think about was reuniting with Jane. As the funeral drew to a close, Paul was approached by Priest Choi, an elderly man who had known Paul's family for decades. Choi's expression was grave, and he pulled Paul aside. "I sense a dark presence around you, Paul," Choi said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "A great deal of evil and deadly intent is directed at you." Paul laughed nervously, attempting to brush off the priest's words. But Choi persisted, asking probing questions about recent events and warning Paul that he might be the target of an evil curse. As Choi spoke, Paul's facade of confidence began to crack. Feeling a creeping fear, he confessed everything: the affair, the confrontation, and Elise's reckless death. Choi's face hardened. "Elise has become a vengeful ghost," he explained, "and she will try to drag you to hell to take her place. Between midnight and 6 a.m., she will have immense powers to exact her revenge." The priest handed Paul a set of 8 talismans. "Hang these around your apartment before midnight," he instructed. "They will prevent her from entering. But you must not leave, no matter what you hear or see, until after 6 a.m. Elise will be relentless because her soul is at stake. If she succeeds, she will reincarnate early, but if she fails, she will be damned for eternity." That night, Paul returned to his apartment, hanging the talismans on every door and window as instructed. As midnight approached, the atmosphere grew thick and heavy. The city lights outside seemed to dim, and an unnatural chill filled the room. Paul sat on the floor, hugging his knees, praying for time to pass quickly. At the stroke of midnight, the doorbell rang, then rang again, more insistently. Paul held his breath, refusing to move. The ringing became furious, followed by a series of loud, angry knocks that echoed through the apartment. Then, all at once, the knocking stopped. A young woman's giggle filled the air, but it did not come from the direction of the door, it came from the window to Paul's right. Turning his head, Paul saw Elise's face staring at him from outside the 12th floor window. Her expression was calm, almost gentle, but her skin was pale, and her eyes were cold, unfeeling. She wore the same red dress and makeup from her funeral. "Paul, don't be afraid," she whispered sweetly. "I just want to say goodbye, one last time. Please, let me in." Paul's hands trembled, his heart racing in his chest. He could only shake his head. Elise's expression suddenly twisted into one of agony. "The talismans," she cried. "They hurt me. Please, Paul, take them down. Priest Choi is an evil man, he doesn't want us to reunite." Paul squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears, trying to drown out her voice. For hours, Elise pleaded, begged, and then tried to entice Paul, saying she forgave him, that she was cold and needed his warmth, that she still loved him. When these attempts failed, her tone shifted to anger and threats, vowing to go after Jane next. As the hours passed, Elise's frustration grew. Her once calm demeanor became erratic and maniacal. She cursed Paul, calling him a coward and screaming insults until the clock struck 6 a.m. Instantly, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air warmed, and the city lights returned. Paul felt an immense wave of relief wash over him. He immediately called Priest Choi to thank him and confirm that Elise's time for vengeance had passed. Choi reassured him, and Paul felt he could breathe again. That night, he celebrated with Jane, drinking and laughing as they toasted to their future, confident that the ordeal was behind him. Paul slept deeply for the first time in days, exhausted from the stress of the past few days and relieved that the ordeal seemed to be over. But around midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, a cold so intense it seemed to seep into the very bones of the apartment walls. Paul's breath became visible, a fine mist in the air. He stirred in his sleep, a shiver running through his body, and then he woke with a start. The first thing he noticed was the heaviness on his chest. It felt as if a great weight was pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe. Paul's eyes blinked open, and he found himself staring into the eyes of a baby with a deathly pale face and lifeless, soulless eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. The child sat on his chest, its small hands pressing down with unnatural strength. The umbilical cord, still slick and raw, draped across Paul's body like a grotesque tether to something beyond the grave. The baby's mouth opened slowly, but no sound came out, only a cold breeze that sent shivers down Paul's spine. Though Jane wanted to sleep in, the intrusive sunlight would not allow it. This annoyed Jane. Without opening her eyes, she groggily told Paul to close the blinds. Paul, however, did not respond, which further annoyed Jane, and she reached out for Paul, her hand landing on his arm, ice cold to the touch. Confused, she sat up and gasped in horror. Paul lay next to her, eyes wide open, frozen in a look of pure terror. His mouth was slightly agape, and the skin around his neck was marked with deep, dark bruises in the shape of a rope, though no rope was anywhere to be seen.